What's going on? Welcome to Tech with Sean, and today we're taking a look at this beast, the GTX 1080 Ti. In 2016, NVIDIA released their 10 series cards, codenamed Pascal, onto the market. They followed that up in 2017 with the release of their flagship card, the GTX 1080 Ti. The 1080 Ti was a beast. It had 3,584 CUDA cores, and 11 gigabytes of GDDR5X memory. This was a huge bump over the previous generation's 980 Ti, and it was a significant leap over the GTX 1080. It also came out during a time of cryptocurrency mining, and this really threw a monkey wrench into the availability and pricing factor for a lot of people. Regardless, it ended up being a very popular model of card. This specific one is the Asus Strix OC model, and I picked this up on eBay used right after they announced the 20 series cards, and I got a really good price on this, and they're still selling for about the same price today. With the 3000 series cards on the horizon though, this thing's about to be 2 generations old. But is it even time to upgrade yet? Depending on what you play and what you're trying to do, this may still be plenty of GPU for you. So we're going to load up some games today. We're going to try some stuff in both 1080p and 1440p, and we're going to see what kind of performance this card can still deliver here in 2020, 3 years after its release. Alright, here we are getting it hooked up. Now this card is usually in my wife's 7700K system over here, but for testing purposes I got it pulled over here, and we're going to run it on a 5 GHz 9900K with 32 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz DDR4. So should be able to push the card to its full potential as soon as we get the new driver installed. Okay, first things first, we're running this basic overclock today. We just have 80 megahertz on the core clock and 500 megahertz on the memory clock, and we're going to run that for all the tests that we're going to show today. First thing we have up is 3D Mark Firestrike. This is always, a good test to just show a baseline performance, and it's easy to compare against other scores. And here our score is coming up, and we hit almost 25,000 points, and that's actually a pretty good score as far as this benchmark goes. So if we compare it to other results online, once the page loads up here, you're going to see that it says it's higher than 98% of results, and it's actually higher than what it says is a high-end gaming PC 2020. So if you're wondering if the 1080 Ti is still good in 2020, Firestrike says it's still better than a high-end gaming PC, so there you go. Next we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and for this one we're running at 2560 by 1440 and very high settings. And we're going to run the benchmark and see what that does for us. Now here it's loaded up and we're running at about 70-ish frames per second, and it might drop down closer to 60, but overall this is a pretty solid experience on this 1440p. And if you really needed more frames, you could always turn down things like the volumetric lighting, and that's going to make a big difference. And here you can see the average result we got was 74 frames per second. Now redoing the test at 1080p, and you can see that we're getting probably, 15 to 20 more frames per second. So it is noticeably smoother, but it's not proportionally smoother dropping to 1080p as it is like the pixel count. So here you can see it's 94 frames per second, so 20 was the average gain. Next up, this is Far Cry New Dawn, and again we're running at 1440p, and this is ultra settings. And this is a pretty strong benchmark. It really pushes the GPU, but you can see here it's putting up over 100 frames per second, so it's still a very competent card for this game. You're getting a good workout of your 1440p 144 Hz monitor even at ultra settings. And you can see the average here was 107 frames per second, and it dipped down to 86. Next we'll redo it again at 1080p. And here it's pushing the frame rate even higher. it's starting out up over 150, so that's more frames than the monitor can even show, at least this one. So it would totally saturate just about a 1080p 144Hz screen. But it still looks pretty good on here. One thing I will say, this uses, like, I believe, TAA anti-aliasing, and when you run that at a non-native resolution, it's got some noticeable artifacts around it. Here at 1080p, it brought the average up to 118, so that's really not the hugest bump for dropping the resolution that much. Next up is Grand Theft Auto 5. We're running it at pretty high settings, and I have 2 times MSAA on there. And at 1440p, it's crushing it. We're getting well over 100 frames per second. This game will run on a wide variety of cards pretty well. It's a well-optimized game, but at the higher settings, it still takes a decent card to push it that far. Next, we'll redo it at the same settings at 1080p. And here you can see it's pushing it slightly farther. Again, it is higher than the 1440p frame rate, but it's not like a huge jump. So if you have the option, 1440p I think is definitely the sweet spot to be gaming at on a 1080 Ti. Alright, now we got Red Dead Redemption 2, and we're running this at pretty high settings. Not everything is maxed out because that'll just kill the frame rate even on a 2080 Ti, but we have it at pretty respectable settings. And here you can see it's driving 70-ish frames per second inside, and this is a pretty, I would say, average for the performance of the game. In most places it's going to get well over 60 frames per second, and it's going to be nice and smooth. Now he's running out into the streets of Saint Denis, and this is one of the most taxing parts of the whole game, so this performance through this area is pretty representative with the worst it's going to do. So you can see here it's running in the 60s, and then in the really geometry dense parts like these trees, it's dropping down to 58, 60 frames per second. But once you get out of Saint Denis, the game's going to be over 60 all the time. So it's really up to you what you want to do with the settings. There's plenty of room to drop them. But here the average was 63, so that's plenty playable, and that's at 1440p at really high settings, and this is one of the most demanding PC games out. Now we're going to drop it to 1080p and see what this does, and it looks like we're getting about 20 more frames per second, and that's been pretty average, I would say, with the experience in most of the games so far. About 10 to 15 frames difference. Let's see what it does when he goes outside. Okay, now we're dropping into the 80s, so 1080p, it's going to keep you from dropping down below 60, even here in the most demanding parts, but then again, so would just dropping a couple options at 1440p, so again, it's really a trade-off however you want to go through it. But it's about to wrap up here, and let's see what kind of results we got at 1080p. So the average here was 83, and the minimum was 68, so I kept the minimums up over 60. Alright, well there you go. This card was once a beast, and it really still is a beast. Unless you're trying to do ray tracing, this totally still creams all esports and online games. If you're playing at 1440p, it's still good for AAA games. 1080p, you can still push those refresh rates way up there. It still has 11 gigs of VRAM, so that's not really going to be a bottleneck for you. It's really damn near all around still a good card. It's almost like the successor to the 8800 GT, if you ask me. That was like the last really legendary NVIDIA card. Like if you bought an 8800 GT when it came out, you were good in games for like years and years. And I feel like that's going to be the same case with the 1080 Ti. If you bought that card at launch, you were set, and you've been gaming at high settings, high refresh rates ever since. And really, I think you're still going to be even after the 3000 cards come out. What do you think about the 1080 Ti in 2020? Do you think it's still a good card? Are you still using one? Are you trying to get one? Did you used to have one? Do you think it's dumb to get one now? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video.